Jake stared at his bank account on his phone screen for the third time that morning. The numbers hadn't changed. Rent was due in 5 days, and he was short by almost half the amount. His freelance graphic design work had been slow lately, and his savings were completely gone. He sat in his small downtown apartment looking around at the space he might have to give up soon. The place wasn't fancy, but it had big windows that let in perfect morning light, and the location was great for walking to coffee shops and meeting clients. Finding another place this good for the same price would be impossible. Jake had tried, finding a roommate for weeks now. The first guy who responded to his online ad seemed normal until he mentioned his pet snake collection. The second person wanted to turn the living room into a meditation space with burning herbs. The third one asked if Jake minded loud music at 2 a.m. because that's when his creativity peaked. Then Zara contacted him. Her message was short and polite. She said she was a student looking for a quiet place to live. She could pay 3 months' rent up front and didn't need much space. Jake almost deleted the message, thinking it sounded too good to be real. But with his situation getting worse every day, he decided to meet her anyway. They met at a coffee shop near his apartment. Jake got there early and ordered his usual drink, watching the door for someone who might be Zara. When she walked in, he knew it was her immediately. She had an unusual way of moving, very smooth and deliberate, like she was thinking about each step. Her dark hair was perfectly neat, and she wore simple clothes that looked expensive but not flashy. "You must be Jake," she said, sitting down across from him. Her voice had a slight accent he couldn't place. "Thank you for meeting with me on such short notice." Jake was surprised by how formal she sounded, but he found it refreshing after dealing with so many casual people who couldn't even show up on time. "No problem. So you're looking for a place to stay?" "Yes, I am studying human behavioral patterns. At the university," Zara explained. "I need somewhere quiet where I can focus on my research. I don't watch television loudly, I don't have parties, and I keep very regular hours." Jake almost laughed. After the parade of weird potential roommates he'd met, someone this normal seemed like a dream. "What kind of research are you doing exactly?" "I observe how people interact in their daily lives, how they form relationships, how they organize their living spaces, how they respond to different situations." She paused and took a sip of her coffee. "It's quite fascinating, actually. Humans have such complex social structures." The way she said humans struck Jake as a bit odd, like she was talking about a different species, but international students sometimes spoke in ways that sounded strange to native speakers. He didn't think much of it. "The apartment has 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, Jake explained. "You'd have your own room and we'd share the kitchen and living room. The rent is split down the middle, plus utilities." Zara nodded. "That sounds perfectly acceptable. When could I move in?" Jake was taken aback by how quickly she was ready to decide. "Don't you want to see the place first? Check out the neighborhood?" "I drove by earlier to assess the location. It meets my requirements." She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. "I can pay the first 3 months today if that would help." Jake's eyes widened as she placed the envelope on the table. He could see cash inside, more money than he'd seen in one place for months. His financial problems would be solved instantly. "Are you sure about this? I mean, we just met. Maybe you should think about it for a day or 2. Zara smiled, and Jake noticed her teeth were incredibly white and perfectly straight. "I'm very good at making quick decisions about people. I can tell you're trustworthy." That afternoon, Zara moved in. Jake was amazed at how little stuff she had. Just 2 suitcases and a box of what looked like electronic equipment. She explained that she preferred to live simply and that most of her belongings were back in her home country. Her electronic devices were the most interesting things she brought. They looked like tablets or small computers, but the designs were unlike anything Jake had seen before. The screens had an unusual blue glow, and they seemed to respond to touch in ways that were incredibly smooth and fast. "These are prototypes from a tech company back home," Zara explained when she noticed Jake looking at them. "They're testing new interface designs." Jake was impressed. "Your home country must be pretty advanced. Where exactly are you from?" "A very remote region," Zara said quickly. "Most people haven't heard of it. We tend to be quite isolated, which is why I'm here studying how other cultures live." Within the first week, Jake realized he'd found the perfect roommate. Zara was incredibly clean and organized. She never left dishes in the sink or forgot to take out the trash. She paid for groceries without being asked and somehow always knew exactly what temperature to keep the apartment. But she had some unusual habits that Jake started to notice. She never seemed to sleep at the same time he did. Jake would go to bed around midnight and wake up around 8 a.m., but he never heard Zara moving around during normal sleeping hours. Instead, he'd sometimes hear her walking around at 3 or 4 in the morning. She also had a strange relationship with food. Jake never saw her eat normal meals. She'd occasionally drink something from unmarked bottles that had a slight glow to them. When Jake asked about it, she said it was a special health drink from her homeland that helped with jet lag and energy levels. The most peculiar thing was how she spent her evenings. After Jake finished his work for the day, he'd usually watch TV or browse the internet. But Zara would stand by the big living room window and stare out at the sky for hours. Sometimes her lips would move slightly, like she was talking to herself, but Jake never heard any sound. Her electronics also behaved strangely. They seemed to light up when she entered a room and dim when she left. Jake figured they must have some kind of motion sensors, but the response was so immediate and precise that it almost seemed like they were reacting to her presence specifically. Despite these odd habits, Jake found living with Zara incredibly peaceful. She respected his space and his work schedule. She never brought friends over or played loud music. She even helped him organize his design workspace in a way that made him much more productive. The strangest thing about Zara, though, was how she seemed to know things about him that he'd never told her. She'd sometimes mention that he seemed stressed about a project before he'd said anything about it. She always knew when he'd had a difficult day with clients, even if he tried to hide it. When Jake asked how she could tell, Zara would smile and say she was very good at reading body language and facial expressions. It was part of her research into human behavior. She said people from her region were trained from childhood to be very observant of others. Jake had to admit that having such an attentive roommate was actually nice. After years of living alone and dealing with friends who were too busy to pay attention to how he was feeling, it was refreshing to live with someone who seemed to genuinely care about his well-being. As the weeks passed, Jake found himself looking forward to their brief conversations in the morning or evening. Zara would ask thoughtful questions about his work or his day, and she always listened carefully to his answers. She had a way of making him feel like what he was saying was important and interesting, but even as Jake grew comfortable with their living arrangement, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unusual about his new roommate. The way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she seemed to understand things that other people missed. It all added up to someone who was unlike anyone he'd ever met before. Still, Jake was happy. His financial problems were solved. His apartment was cleaner than it had ever been, and he had a roommate who was respectful and kind. Whatever secrets Zara might have, they didn't seem to be hurting anyone. For now, that was enough. 2 months had passed since Zara moved in, and Jake was starting to pay closer attention to things that didn't quite add up. At first, he'd been so grateful for a good roommate that he ignored the weird stuff. But now that his money problems were solved and life was calmer, he couldn't help but notice how strange some of her habits really were. The food situation was getting more obvious. Jake had started keeping track without really meaning to. He'd bought groceries 3 times since she moved in, and none of his food ever went missing, not even a piece of fruit or a snack. Most people would at least grab something from the fridge, occasionally, especially when they were in a hurry. But Zara never touched any of it. Instead, she had those glowing drinks that she kept in her room. Jake had tried to get a closer look at the bottles, but she always put them away quickly when he was around. Once, he caught a glimpse of one sitting on the kitchen counter. The liquid inside had a soft blue light that seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat. When he asked about it, Zara gave him the same answer as always. It was a special health supplement from her home region. But Jake had never seen anything like it in any store, and he'd started looking. He'd even searched online for glowing health drinks, but nothing came up that looked similar. Then there was the mail situation. Jake usually grabbed the mail for both of them, and he'd noticed that Zara received letters addressed to different versions of her name. Sometimes it was Zara Chen, sometimes Z Chen, other times it was Zara C, or even just ZC. The return addresses were from places he'd never heard of, institutions and organizations with names that sounded official but didn't seem to exist when he looked them up online. One envelope had caught his attention because it was made of material that felt different from normal paper. It was slightly warm to the touch and had a faint shimmer when he held it up to the light. When he handed it to Zara, she took it quickly and thanked him, but he noticed her eyes had gotten wider for just a second, like she was surprised or worried. Jake started watching Zara more carefully during their evening routines. Every night, she would stand by the living room window and look up at the sky for at least an hour. At first, Jake thought she might be interested in astronomy or maybe just enjoyed stargazing, but her behavior was too focused and intense for casual sky watching. She would position herself in exactly the same spot each night, and her lips would move in patterns that looked like she was having a conversation. Jake tried to listen from the kitchen or his bedroom, but he never heard any sound. Sometimes her head would tilt slightly, like she was listening to something, and then she'd nod or shake her head in response. The electronics were becoming more mysterious, too. Jake was pretty tech-savvy from his design work, but Zara's devices did things that seemed impossible. They would light up before she entered a room, almost like they knew she was coming. When she touched the screens, they responded, instantly, faster than any device Jake had ever used. One evening, Jake was working late on a project when his computer started acting up. The screen was flickering, and his design software kept crashing. He was getting frustrated because he had a deadline the next morning. Zara appeared in his doorway, even though he hadn't made any noise that would have alerted her to his problem. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "Your stress levels seem elevated." Jake looked up, confused. "My stress levels? How can you tell that?" "Body language," she said quickly. "And I could hear you sighing from my room." She walked over to his computer and looked at the screen. Without asking permission, she placed her hand near his laptop. She didn't actually touch it, but her hand hovered about an inch above the keyboard. Suddenly, the flickering stopped and his software started working perfectly again. "What did you do?" Jake asked, staring at his computer screen. "Sometimes electronics just need a moment to reset," Zara said. "I have experience with technical troubleshooting." But Jake was sure she hadn't pressed any buttons or touched any cables. Somehow, just being near his computer had fixed the problem. That wasn't how technology worked, at least not any technology he knew about. The incident that really made Jake start questioning everything happened on a Thursday night. He was cooking dinner and decided to try a new recipe that required him to cut up a lot of vegetables. He was rushing because he wanted to finish before his favorite TV show started, and he wasn't being as careful as he should have been. The knife slipped while he was chopping an onion, and he cut his hand pretty deeply. Blood started flowing immediately, and Jake knew he'd need stitches. He grabbed a kitchen towel and pressed it against the cut, but the bleeding wasn't stopping. "I think I need to go to the hospital," he called out, not sure if Zara was even home. She appeared in the kitchen so quickly that Jake wondered if she'd been standing right outside the door. When she saw the blood, her entire demeanor changed. Her eyes seemed to get brighter, almost like they were reflecting light that wasn't there. She moved toward him with a speed and grace that seemed impossible. "Let me see," she said, her voice sounding different, more commanding and confident than usual. Before Jake could object, she gently moved his hand away from the cut. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device that looked like a cross between a pen and a tiny flashlight. It had a soft silver glow and made a very quiet humming sound. "What is that?" Jake asked. But Zara was already holding it over his wound. The device emitted a warm light that felt soothing against his skin. Jake watched in amazement as the bleeding stopped immediately. Even more incredible, the cut itself seemed to be closing. Within about 30 seconds, there was nothing left but a thin line that looked like an old scar. Jake stared at his hand, turning it over to make sure he wasn't imagining things. The pain was completely gone, and there was no sign that he'd just had a serious injury. "How is that possible?" he whispered. Zara put the device back in her pocket quickly. "It's an advanced first aid technique from my homeland. We use a combination of light therapy and pressure point stimulation to accelerate natural healing." But Jake had seen what happened. The light from her device had done something that was way beyond any first aid technique he'd ever heard of, and the way her eyes had changed when she saw the blood. That wasn't normal either. "Where exactly did you say you were from again?" Jake asked. Zara hesitated for just a moment before answering. "A very remote region in the northern mountains. We've developed some unique medical practices because we're so far from modern hospitals." Jake wanted to believe her explanation, but nothing about what had just happened seemed like it could be from any place on Earth. The device, the instant healing, the way she'd moved, it all felt like something from a science fiction movie. That night, Jake lay in bed thinking about everything he'd observed over the past 2 months. Individually, each strange thing about Zara could maybe be explained away. But when he put them all together, they painted a picture that was hard to ignore. His roommate wasn't just unusual. She was impossible. And Jake was starting to think that whatever secret she was hiding was much bigger than just being from a different country. He decided he needed to find out what was really going on. But he also knew he had to be careful. Zara had been nothing but kind to him, and he didn't want to ruin their living situation if he was wrong about his suspicions. Still, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was living with someone who wasn't quite what she seemed to be, and despite how crazy it sounded even to himself, he was starting to wonder if Zara might not be entirely human. Jake couldn't sleep. It was 2:30 in the morning, and he'd been lying in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything that had happened over the past few weeks. The incident with his cut hand kept replaying in his mind. No matter how he tried to rationalize it, there was no normal explanation for what he'd witnessed. He'd spent the last few days trying to act normal around Zara, but it was getting harder. Every time she did something even slightly unusual, his mind would start racing with questions. When she positioned herself by the window for her nightly sky-watching ritual, he found himself wondering who she might be communicating with. When her electronic devices lit up in response to her presence, he couldn't help but think about technology that seemed decades ahead of anything he'd ever seen. Jake rolled over and checked his phone. 2:47 a.m. Right on schedule, he heard the familiar sound of the bathroom door closing and the shower turning on. Zara's late-night bathroom routine had become as predictable as clockwork. Every single night at almost exactly this time, she would spend about 30 minutes in there. At first, Jake had assumed she was just someone who preferred to shower at odd hours. Maybe she was self-conscious about sharing a bathroom, or maybe it was a cultural thing from wherever she was really from. But tonight, as he listened to the water running, he noticed something different. There was a sound underneath the normal shower noise, a soft humming that seemed to have a rhythm to it. It wasn't music, and it didn't sound like Zara humming to herself. It was more like the sound her electronic devices made, but louder and more complex. Jake sat up in bed, listening more carefully. Along with the humming, he could see a faint blue light coming from under the bathroom door. It wasn't the normal harsh white light of their bathroom fixtures. This was the same soft blue glow he'd seen from Zara's mysterious drinks and her electronic devices. His curiosity finally got the better of him. Jake knew it was wrong to spy on his roommate, and under normal circumstances, he would never even think about it. But these weren't normal circumstances. Everything about Zara was strange, and he was starting to feel like he was living with someone who might not be who she claimed to be. Jake got out of bed as quietly as possible and crept toward the bathroom. The apartment's old wooden floors creaked slightly under his feet, and he paused after each step to make sure the shower was still running. The blue light was definitely getting brighter as he got closer. When he reached the bathroom door, Jake could hear that the humming sound was actually more like electronic music, complex tones and rhythms that seemed to be coming from multiple sources at once. It was beautiful in a way, but completely unlike anything he'd ever heard before. Jake knew what he was about to do was a huge violation of privacy, but he felt like he needed to know the truth. He positioned himself near the door and looked for a way to see inside without being obvious about it. The door was old and didn't fit perfectly in its frame, leaving a small gap near the hinges. What Jake saw through that gap changed everything he thought he knew about his roommate. Zara was standing in the shower, but she looked nothing like the person he'd been living with for the past 2 months. Her skin was glowing with intricate patterns that moved and shifted like living artwork. The patterns weren't just on the surface, they seemed to go deeper, like they were part of her actual body structure. Her hair, which was normally dark brown and perfectly ordinary, was floating around her head as if she was underwater, even though Jake could clearly see the shower spray falling normally. The strands moved independently, each one seeming to have its own gentle current. But the most shocking thing was her reflection in the bathroom mirror. While Zara's physical body showed her glowing, transformed state, her reflection showed something completely different. The face looking back at her from the mirror had larger eyes that were completely silver, with no visible pupils. Her features were more angular and refined than her human appearance, and her skin in the reflection had a translucent quality that made her look almost ethereal. Jake realized he was looking at some kind of advanced disguise technology. The Zara he'd been talking to and living with was essentially a projection or transformation of what she really looked like. And what she really looked like was definitely not human. As he watched, Zara raised her hands toward the shower head, and the water began to glow with the same blue light that filled the room. She wasn't just taking a shower. She was going through some kind of process that seemed part cleaning, part recharging, and part communication. The electronic humming got louder, and Jake could see that Zara's glowing patterns were pulsing in, rhythm with the sounds. It was like she was part of a larger system, receiving and transmitting information through the strange blue energy that surrounded her. Jake's mind was racing. Everything suddenly made sense. The weird food, the strange mail, the electronic devices that responded to her presence, the healing device that had fixed his cut instantly. Zara wasn't from a remote region of Earth. She wasn't even from Earth at all. He was living with an alien. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Jake stepped back from the door, his heart pounding so hard he was sure Zara would be able to hear it over the shower noise. He felt dizzy and had to lean against the wall to steady himself. Part of him wanted to run, pack his bags, and get out of the apartment before Zara finished her transformation process and came out of the bathroom. But another part of him was fascinated. He'd just witnessed something that most people would never see in their entire lives. First contact with an extraterrestrial being, and it was happening in his own bathroom. Jake tried to process what this meant. If Zara was an alien, why was she here? What did she want? Was she dangerous? She'd been nothing but kind and helpful since she moved in, but maybe that was all part of some larger plan. The shower turned off suddenly, and Jake panicked. He rushed back to his bedroom as quietly as possible and jumped into bed, pulling the covers up and trying to control his breathing. A few minutes later, he heard the bathroom door open and Zara's footsteps moving toward her room. Jake lay there in the dark, his mind spinning with questions and implications. Should he confront her? Should he call someone? Who would he even call? The police would think he was crazy. The government might take her away for experiments, and despite everything, Jake didn't want anything bad to happen to Zara. She'd been a perfect roommate, alien or not. She'd solved his financial problems, kept the apartment clean, and had even saved him from a serious injury. If she wanted to hurt him, she'd had plenty of opportunities already. But the fact remained that he'd been lied to for months. Zara had been studying him, observing his daily routines and behavior patterns, all while pretending to be a human exchange student. Jake felt like he'd been living in some kind of experiment without knowing it. As the hours passed and dawn started to break outside his window, Jake realized he was going to have to make a decision. He could continue pretending he didn't know the truth, letting Zara maintain her disguise and carry on with whatever mission had brought her to Earth. Or he could confront her and demand answers about who she really was and what she wanted. The thought of that conversation terrified him, but Jake knew he couldn't go back to pretending everything was normal. Not after what he'd seen. His quiet, ordinary life had just become the most extraordinary thing he could imagine. He was sharing his apartment with a being from another world, and somehow he was going to have to figure out what to do about it. Jake spent the entire next day in a strange fog of disbelief and nervous energy. He kept telling himself that maybe he'd been dreaming, or maybe the stress of his work deadlines had made him imagine things. But every time he looked at Zara during their brief interactions throughout the day, he could see subtle signs that he'd missed before. The way she moved was too smooth, too calculated. Her responses to his questions came just a fraction of a second too quickly, like she was processing information faster than a normal person could. And her eyes, Jake couldn't believe he'd never noticed how they seemed to reflect light in ways that didn't quite match the lighting in the room. By evening, Jake had made his decision. He couldn't keep living with this secret knowledge, pretending everything was normal while knowing that his roommate was literally from another world. The not knowing what she wanted or why she was here was driving him crazy with worry and curiosity. Jake waited until after dinner, when Zara had settled into her usual spot by the living room window for her nightly sky observation. He took a deep breath, walked over to where she was standing, and positioned himself directly in front of her. "We need to talk," he said, his voice shakier than he'd intended. Zara looked at him with what appeared to be genuine surprise. "Of course. Is everything all right? You've seemed distressed today." "Yeah, well, finding out your roommate isn't human tends to do that to a person." The words hung in the air between them. Jake watched Zara's face carefully, expecting her to deny it or ask what he meant. Instead, her shoulders seemed to relax, and she let out a long breath that sounded almost like relief. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. Jake felt his legs go weak. Part of him had still been hoping she would laugh and tell him he was being ridiculous. Hearing her confirm his suspicions made everything real in a way that was both terrifying and amazing. "I saw you last night," he said. "In the bathroom. The blue light, the way you looked in the mirror, that wasn't human." Zara nodded slowly. "I was wondering when you might figure it out. You're much more observant than most humans I've encountered." "Most humans you've encountered?" Jake repeated. "How many people like me have you been studying?" "You're the first one I've lived with," Zara said. "My previous observations were conducted from a distance, but my supervisors felt that closer contact would provide more valuable data about human domestic behavior and social bonding." Jake sat down heavily on the couch. "So I'm what? Some kind of experiment? A lab rat?" "It wasn't supposed to be like that," Zara said quickly, moving to sit across from him. "The initial plan was purely observational. I was supposed to document your daily routines, your emotional responses to different situations, how you interacted with your environment and other humans." "But," Jake prompted, sensing there was more, But something unexpected happened. The longer I stayed here, the more I began to understand concepts that my people have difficulty with. Friendship, trust, caring about someone's well-being not because it serves a purpose, but simply because you value their happiness. Jake looked at her carefully. Even knowing what he knew now, she still looked like the same person who had moved in 2 months ago. Are you saying you actually care about me? Or is that just part of the research too? That's what I'm trying to explain, Zara said, her voice taking on a tone of frustration that sounded completely genuine. It wasn't supposed to be part of the research. My people don't form emotional attachments the way humans do. We work together efficiently. We share information. We cooperate for mutual benefit. But what you call friendship, this desire to help someone even when it doesn't benefit you, that's something we're still trying to understand. Jake's mind was spinning with questions. Who are your people? Where do you come from? Why are you studying us? Zara was quiet for a moment, like she was deciding how much to tell him. My species comes from a star system about 40 light years from here. We've been observing Earth for several decades, trying to understand human civilization before we make official contact. Official contact? Jake's eyes widened. You mean like landing ships and meeting with world leaders? Eventually, yes. But we've learned from observing other species that first contact can be traumatic if it's not handled carefully. We wanted to understand human psychology and social structures so we could approach your leaders in a way that wouldn't cause panic or hostility. Jake tried to wrap his head around the implications. So there are more of you here? Other aliens? Pretending to be human? A small advance team, yes. We're embedded in different human communities, studying various aspects of your society. I was assigned to learn about domestic life and close personal relationships. And you chose me because... Zara looked slightly embarrassed. Your online profile suggested you were open-minded and unlikely to report unusual behavior to authorities. You also appeared to be socially isolated enough that an observer could live with you without having to interact with large numbers of other humans. Jake wasn't sure whether to be insulted or flattered. So, you picked me because I'm a loner with no friends? I picked you because you seemed kind and unlikely to be dangerous, Zara corrected. And I was right about that. Even now, knowing what... your first concern seems to be understanding rather than protecting yourself. Jake realized she was right. Despite the fear and confusion, he wasn't actually afraid of Zara herself. She'd had countless opportunities to hurt him if that had been her intention. What happens now? Do you report back to your supervisors that I found out? I have to file regular reports, yes. But Jake, what I've learned living with you has been more valuable than anything my people hoped to discover. The way you trusted me despite obvious signs that something was unusual. The way you helped me understand human customs without even realizing you were doing it. The kindness you showed when you thought I was just a foreign student trying to adapt. Zara paused and looked directly at him. I've experienced something that my species considers impossible. I've grown attached to a human being. Not just as a research subject, but as someone I genuinely care about. Someone whose happiness matters to me. Jake felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of him was still processing the fact that he was having this conversation with an extraterrestrial being, but another part of him was touched by what she'd said. So what does that mean for us? For this? He gestured around the apartment. I don't know, Zara admitted. I'm supposed to complete my mission and return to my ship in a few weeks, but the thought of leaving and never seeing you again is difficult. It's causing what you might call emotional distress. Your ship? Jake asked. It's positioned in orbit around your moon. My team and I return there periodically to submit reports and receive new instructions. Jake leaned back against the couch, trying to process everything. This is insane. A month ago, my biggest problem was paying rent. Now I'm learning that aliens are studying humanity, and I've accidentally become friends with one of them. Are we friends? Zara asked. and there was something hopeful in her voice that made her seem more human than she'd ever seemed before. Jake looked at her, really looked at her. Despite everything he'd learned, despite the deception and the otherworldly truth, she was still the same person who had been considerate and helpful and genuinely good company for the past 2 months. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think we are friends. Weird, impossible, probably dangerous friends, but friends." Zara smiled, and Jake could swear her eyes got a little brighter. "My supervisors are going to find this very difficult to understand." "Well," Jake said, feeling slightly more confident now that the initial shock was wearing off, "maybe it's time they learn something new about humans. We're pretty good at making friends with people who are different from us." For the first time since this whole conversation started, Jake felt like maybe this could work out. He had no idea what it meant to be friends with an alien, or what would happen when her mission was over, but he was willing to find out. Over the next few days, Jake found himself living in a completely different world, even though nothing in his apartment had physically changed. Knowing the truth about Zara had transformed every interaction they had. When she stood by the window, at night, he now understood she was actually communicating with her ship. When her devices lit up around her, he realized he was witnessing technology that was decades or maybe centuries ahead of anything humans had developed. But the strangest part was how normal it all felt. Zara was still the same considerate roommate she'd always been. She still kept the apartment clean, still paid her share of expenses, still asked thoughtful questions about his work. The only difference was that now Jake could ask questions too, and she would give him honest answers. "What's it like up there?" Jake asked one evening, gesturing toward the ceiling. "On your ship, I mean." Zara considered the question carefully. "Very different from here. Everything is designed for efficiency rather than comfort. We don't have personal spaces the way humans do. We don't eat meals together or spend time just talking for pleasure. It's all very purposeful. Do you miss it?" "I thought I would," she said. "But living here has shown me things I didn't know I was missing. The way you make coffee in the morning and offer me some, even though you know I don't drink it. The way you ask about my day, not because you need information, but because you're genuinely interested. These small acts of kindness, we don't have anything like that." Jake was fascinated by these glimpses into alien culture, but he was also growing worried about what would happen when Zara's mission ended. They'd been dancing around the topic for days, but he knew they couldn't avoid it forever. That conversation came sooner than he expected. On Thursday evening, Zara seemed unusually quiet during dinner. She kept checking one of her devices, and Jake could see a soft urgency in the way the screen pulsed. "I received a message today," she finally said. "My supervisors want me to return to the ship for debriefing. They're concerned about some of the reports I've been sending." Jake felt his stomach drop. "What kind of concerns?" "I've been documenting the emotional bonds that can form between humans, but I've also been honest about my own experiences. They're finding it difficult to understand why I would develop personal attachment to a research subject." "So what does that mean?" Zara hesitated. "They want to conclude my mission early. They think extended contact with humans might be compromising my objectivity." Jake set down his fork. "When do you have to go?" "Tomorrow night." The word hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd known this moment would come eventually, but tomorrow felt impossibly soon. "Can't you tell them you need more time? That your research isn't complete?" "I could try," Zara said. "But Jake, there's something else. They're planning to move forward with official first contact much sooner than originally intended, within the next few months." Jake's eyes widened. "You mean they're going to reveal themselves to the world?" "Yes. And based on the reports from all the advanced teams, they're not entirely optimistic about how humans will react. Some of my colleagues have observed significant hostility toward anything perceived as different or threatening." Jake thought about this. What if they had help? Someone who could explain that you're not here to hurt anyone. "What do you mean?" Jake took a deep breath. "What if instead of just observing humans, you worked with one? What if you had a human partner who could help bridge the gap between our species? Zara looked confused. I don't understand. How would that work? I could help, Jake said, the idea forming as he spoke. I could be like a cultural translator. Help your people understand how humans think, and help humans understand that your people aren't a threat. Jake, you don't understand what you're suggesting. This would change your entire life. You'd be involved in the most significant event in human history. Maybe, Jake said. Or maybe I'd just be helping my friend figure out how to make a good first impression. Zara stared at him. You would do that? Risk everything to help my people make contact with yours? I'd do it to help you, Jake said simply. And because I think both our species could benefit from understanding each other better. You've shown me that beings from different worlds can become friends. Maybe it's time more people learned that. That night, Zara spent hours at her communication devices, having what appeared to be intense discussions with her supervisors. Jake could hear the complex electronic tones from his bedroom, rising and falling in patterns that sounded almost like arguments. The next morning, Zara looked exhausted but determined. I spoke with my superiors about your proposal, she said. They're intrigued. The concept of voluntary cooperation from a human is something they hadn't considered. And? They want to meet you. Jake felt his heart start racing. Meet me, like go up to your ship? Just for a few hours. They want to evaluate whether a human partnership could be beneficial for the contact mission. Zara paused. Jake, I have to warn you. If you do this, there's no going back. Even if the partnership doesn't work out, you'll know things that most humans won't learn for months or years. Your life will never be the same. Jake thought about his quiet, ordinary existence. Before Zara moved in, his biggest concerns had been paying rent and meeting deadlines. Now he was being offered a chance to be part of something that would change the course of human history. What happens if I say no? He asked. I return to the ship, file my final report, and you never see me again. Eventually, my people make contact with your world leaders, and hopefully everything goes smoothly. And if I say yes? We try something that has never been attempted before. We try to build a bridge between two species before official contact occurs. We try to make sure that when our peoples meet, it's with understanding rather than fear. Jake looked around his apartment at the place where he'd discovered that he wasn't alone in the universe, where he'd learned that friendship could cross the boundaries between worlds. When do we leave? He asked. Zara's face lit up with something that looked like relief and excitement. Tonight. Are you sure about this, Jake? No, Jake said honestly. I'm terrified, but I'm also more excited than I've ever been in my life. Besides, someone has to make sure you don't get too homesick when you're back up there. That evening, as Jake prepared for a journey he could never have imagined a week ago, he realized that his search for the perfect roommate had led to something far more important. He'd found a friend who had shown him that the universe was much bigger and more wonderful than he'd ever dreamed. And now, together, they were going to try to help two worlds understand that difference didn't have to mean danger, and that the unknown could be the beginning of something beautiful rather than something to fear. As they prepared to leave for the ship that waited beyond the stars, Jake couldn't help but smile. His ordinary life was over, but his extraordinary life was just beginning.